Module 6, Lesson 5, NFS Data Stores. After this lesson, you should be able to describe NFS components, describe the differences between NFS version 3 and version 4.1, configure and manage NFS data stores. So the components of NFS, you have a NAS device or a server with NFS server running. We need the directory to share with the ESXi host, and then we need the IP of the NAS or server that's running NFS, and that needs to go over an IP network. We need a ESXi host with a NIC that's mapped to a virtual switch, so we need an uplink, and then we need a VM kernel port that's defined on the virtual switch that's on the same IP network as the NAS or server that's hosting NFS. So we create a VM kernel port, and for performance and security, you need to separate the NFS network from the iSCSI network if you're using iSCSI. NFS can provide the following. It needs to know if it's version 3 or 4.1, the data store name, the IP address or server names if you want to use DNS as the NFS server or to access the NFS server. The folder on the NFS server, for example, they could be a templates folder or NFS share. And then we need to select host that will mount the data store and whether to mount the NFS file system read-only, and then any authentication parameters we might have to access the NFS server. So NFS 3 versus 4.1. In version 3, ESXi managed the multipathing. The off-sys root authentication was needed with NFS 3, and it had VMware proprietary file locking, and it had client-side error tracking. In version 4, we have native multipathing and session trunking, so we don't have to configure anything with ESXi to do that. We'll do that on the NFS server via the NFS protocol. You can have optional Kerberos authentication, so then we don't need to, and I remember this in version 3, you would have to have a NFS server or NAS that can mount or share a folder as root or squash FSS. So you actually give it to where when they map this NFS folder, they're assuming they're root. You don't have to do that with 4.1, we use optional Kerberos. NFS 4.1 has built-in file locking, and it has server-side error tracking. Both version 3 and version 4.1 is compatible with all these vSphere technologies. Best practices for NFS data store. Configure the NFS array to allow only one NFS protocol, so don't mix and match version 3 and 4.1. And use whichever one you decide on to mount the same NFS share across all ESXi hosts, so don't mix and match versions on ESXi hosts. Caution when mounting an NFS share. Like it's saying, if you mount the share on as version 3 on one and 4.1 on another, it can lead to data corruption. And version 3 file locking is not compatible with 4.1. So again, if you're going to use NFS with your vSphere environment, pick a version and stick with that version. Here's an example of configuring it. You give it the data store name. This is what the name will show up in your ESXi and vCenter environment. There's the folder that's being shared on our NFS server. And again, this is the IP or name to it. And then again, if we want to mount it read-only, we can do that. That'd be good if we wanted to do one for ISOs. And then when we configure all this, we'll just hit next. Configuring AD and NFS servers to use Kerberos. You need to create an account in AD for NFS version 4.1 access, and then we'll need to tell it to support 128 and 256 in Active Directory for that account. And we need to enable the Kerberos AES extension. Yeah, that's this, sorry. Both of those. So you want to do both 128 and 256. And then we need to go and set the, if you scroll up, you'll see that right there. Select the account expire option to never. And then we configure the NFS servers to use Kerberos and use our Active Directory information, that whatever we've set. And then we need to configure the server shares to grant full access to the Active Directory account used. So then in this example will be the username NFS client. So then when we get to where we configure authentication in NFS Kerberos credentials and ESXi, is it's the requirement of the Kerberos authentication, we need to add each ESXi host to the domain, and then we configure the NFS Kerberos credentials. So we need to join our ESXi servers to the domain, and then we'll add this right there to the Kerberos credentials. Considerations for Kerberos with NFS: be aware of the UID and GID on the files. For version 3, the UID and GID are root, and they're not with version 4. And this is what it says. If we access files created with version 3 from Kerberos client using 4.1, we'll get permission denied errors because the owners are root. And we need to use the same AD user across all ESXi hosts, because vMotion and like DRS and other features might fail if the individual hosts use different user accounts. And then we can use host profiles to help avoid errors when we're configuring all this. Time must be synchronized. Time synchronization is required for Kerberos authentication. You need to configure all your components to synchronize to a NTP server. And Kerberos must be configured on the NS servers and the ESXi host before creating a NFS data store to use Kerberos authentication. Then we go back to configuring the Kerberos. We just check it to enable Kerberos, and then we choose whether we want to do Kerberos for authentication only or for authentication and data integrity. And we can view the details of the VMFS or NFS data stores that we create when we pick the data store on the data store tab. We can see a summary. We can unmount an NFS data store. Unmounting this data store causes the files in the data store to be inaccessible by the ESXi host. So if you had some machines running and you unmounted it, you're going to have some errors, and they won't be able to fail over. It would cause a failover if another host has it and it can access it, so the machine would HA over to another host. Multipathing and NFS 4.1. This is a recommendation to configure one VM kernel port and use adapters attached to the same physical switch to configure NIC teaming. And we configure the NFS server with multiple IP addresses. The IP addresses need to be on the same subnet. And to better utilize multiple links, configure NIC teams with the IP hash load balancing policy. Enable session trunking and multipathing. Multiple IP addresses are configured for each NFS data store. And as you can see here, servers to be added. It will show both IPs. Notice they're on the same subnet, just like it said they should be. You should now be able to describe NFS components, describe the differences between version 3 and 4.1, and configure and manage NFS data stores.